Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I am Colin Starger, a professor and associate dean here at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where I also direct the Legal Data and Design Clinic. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and our panelists to this afternoon's webinar, which looks at the issue of surveillance in our society using biometric and other personal data. Though packaged to the public as tools for better living and for safer communities, we ask whether surveillance technologies actually rob us of our privacy and civil liberties and thereby threaten democracy. We certainly know that it's true that cell phones, cameras, license plate readers, and internet connected devices like Fitbits are able to track our every move, and that data is often uploaded to the cloud and seen by many different people. Businesses and governments surveil people for profit and social control in our own neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, and homes. Sometimes we even surveil ourselves. So how concerned should we all be? Do the harms of these technologies outweigh their benefits? And which communities get the worst of it all? Over the next hour, our three panelists will share their thoughts on these questions and more. I will serve as the moderator for the discussion, and we are looking forward to your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. We'll attempt to get to as many of them as we can. So without any further ado, please allow me to introduce briefly today's panel. I'll start with Nicole Mcconnell. She is an associate professor of law and clinic director at West Virginia University College of Law, where she teaches primarily in the litigation and advocacy clinic. Before joining the WVU faculty, Mcconnell was a clinical teacher here at the University of Baltimore as a fellow in our own Saul Ewing Clinic Advocacy Clinic, pardon me. Nicole also has experience as a lawyer working in consumer protection and disability benefits. Welcome, Nicole. Next is Iha Nguyen. She is the program director in the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society. Data and Society is an independent nonprofit that studies the social implications of data and automation. Nguyen and her team seek to better understand emergent disruptions in the labor force as a result of data-centric technological development. Prior to joining Data and Society, Iha worked to raise job standards for retail, airport, and other service workers and addressed issues of food access and safety at the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy. Nguyen is interested in exploring how workplace monitoring and algorithmic management alter working conditions and raise privacy concerns for employees. Welcome, Iha. And last, but certainly not least, is our very own Michelle Gilman. Michelle is the Venable Professor of Law, Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development, and the Director of the Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic. She's also the co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism here at UB Law. Michelle's scholarship focuses on issues related to poverty, privacy, economic inequality, and feminist legal theory. From 2019 to 2020, Gilman was a faculty fellow at Data and Society, focusing on the intersection of data privacy law with the concerns of low-income communities. Welcome, Michelle. So thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to all of you out there in Zoom land for joining us. Unfortunately, we can't see you. That's just the nature of this particular webinar format. But as I mentioned before, we can see what's going on in the chat and in the Q&A function. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to answer this question, which is really just a get to know you, an opportunity for you to introduce yourselves to the folks participating today. And that question is, what is the lens that you use to analyze the impact of surveillance in law and society? Tell us a little bit about your research perspective and framework on the general issue that we're looking at. And we actually didn't talk about the order that we'll do this. I'll go in the reverse order that I introduced you. So we'll go with Michelle, Iha, and then Nicole.
Sure, thanks, Colin, and great to be here with my colleagues, Nicole and Iha today. So the lens that I use when I think about surveillance is one of economic justice. I direct the Civil Advocacy Clinic, as Colin mentioned, and so I'm supervising students who represent low-income Baltimoreans in a wide array of civil matters. And so I'm always thinking about ways that our laws and policies adversely impact people experiencing poverty. And increasingly over time, the dynamic of technologically enabled surveillance is becoming an overlay and a reality to my clients' lives. So I'll tell you a little more about that. When I started doing this work about 25 years ago, we were helping clients obtain different forms of governmental assistance. That's still a core part of our practice. And at that time, I was really concerned about the privacy deprivations that they suffered as a condition of applying for governmental assistance. When you are a low-income person, you have to turn over a lot of personal data to the state. Depending where you live, you might be drug tested, you might be required to take a DNA test. You have to comply with all sorts of verification requirements about who you are, where you work, where you live, and the like. And you have to answer really intrusive questions about your lifestyle and your personal habits. But when I started, yes, the Department of Social Services had computers, but they were more like glorified typewriters. Over time, that's really shifted where the computers are doing more of the work that caseworkers used to do. And so now we have automated decision-making systems powered by algorithms that determine who's eligible for benefits, monitor folks while they're receiving benefits, and try and identify potential fraud in the population. So now the level of surveillance that poor people have experienced since time immemorial, and certainly since the founding of this country, has a lot more scope, speed, and scale because of these technologies. And I can't help but compare that to the different forms of governmental assistance that middle class and wealthier people get. So it's tax time. You know, many of us are claiming a mortgage interest tax deduction. That is a government benefit, no different than a food stamps or a cash assistance welfare check, because it is money in my pocket that comes out of the government budget. And yet for those types of governmental assistance that wealthier people get, it doesn't come with this intense surveillance overlay. No one's coming to my house to see if I'm telling the truth. The gathering of my data is much more limited in scope. No one is asking me intrusive questions to get it. And so we really see what I've called a class differential in privacy law between the type of data gathered about low-income people, the way it's gathered, the very intrusive way it's gathered, and how similar forms of benefits are awarded to wealthier people without this surveillance overlay. So that's one of many examples, and I'll stop there now so we can hear from my fellow panelists.
Thanks so much. Iha.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. I'm very excited for this conversation. I would say that my frame for approaching this question is in many ways very similar to Michelle's. It is an economic and more specifically a labor power lens from which I view it. Having worked in labor on the ground on organizing, it's really constantly this battle between workers and employers and how much control and power can be exerted by employers onto employees. And surveillance is a critical tool in that. Surveillance is used for control and discipline. And I think in that respect, technologies have not really changed that conversation at all, because Taylorism, began during the Industrial Revolution in the factories that caused rapid amounts of job speed ups that also led to workplace health and safety issues that we're seeing again now. I think what really is distinguishing and makes that power dynamic in that situation even more severe these days is that there is no separation between surveillance and productivity. Essentially, the information that's collected on the devices that workers use are used instantaneously to provide feedback to lead to that speed up, to correct their behavior, to correct their emotions, to correct and discipline them for any particular type of behavior. So, so really that is the lens from which I think about surveillance. The other part that I would mention is that sort of the question of surveillance is really actually not a question for workers. It's, if you ask a worker, well, what do you feel about surveillance? Many would say, my boss has the right to surveil me. It is a prerogative as an employer, and that's written into American law, and it's written into a lot of other laws that employers have the right to feel like that they can surveil employees. Now, does that mean that employees feel like this is right? No, but I think that it is almost like asking that question of whether surveillance can exist in that space is not really the question. The question is like, what does that mean for my conditions at work? What does that mean for the amount of opportunity and control, autonomy, privacy that I may have? So it comes out in many different ways. Mainly again, it is about affecting worker power, and that means many things, but it means the ability of workers to earn a decent wage, keep themselves safe, be autonomous in their work, have opportunities in the future, because so much of surveillance that happens in the workplace and the data that's collected there follows them throughout their employment in many other places as well. So I'll just stop there. There's so much more to be said. And the research has revolved around mainly that, and sort of how do we think about the different ways that surveillance affect workers on multiple levels, on the individual level, on the workforce level, and sort of like broadly on a cultural and social level. What does it say that employers feel like they can observe and surveil workers in any aspect, in any way, often without providing a legitimate reason for it?
Thank you. And before turning to Nicole, let me just ask you to explain a term that you use that I think provides useful historical perspective, but not all of our participants might be familiar with, which is Taylorism. You said that that's not a new thing, and obviously it isn't, but I think that might help.
Sure. Yes. Apologies, I should have done that earlier. So during the Industrial Revolution, a man named Winslow Taylor engaged in this process of measuring every single activity, every single task that employees performed. And primarily it was taking place in the factories, and it occurred along the line with Fordism, which was sort of like the standardization of tasks to allow for mass production. Taylorism is also known as scientific management, but it's essentially what much of surveillance is based on, which is observing the behavior of workers, calculating minutely their tasks, and then using that as the basis for making assessments about performance, discipline, termination, adjusting behavior.
Right. And so what's changed is that we just have that on steroids now. We're able to do it so much quicker and connect it to other types of data and other sources of data. Thank you for that. And Nicole, let's turn the opening question to you.
Hi, thanks, Colin. And so great to see my colleagues and see some of you participants on the participant list. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Nicole Mcconnell. I'm the clinic director at WVU. We are structured as an in-house law firm with 9 different practice groups. Probably about 70 to 80% of our 3Ls take clinic. So it's a really vibrant and robust program, and I'm really enjoying, I've just been there about 2 years, and I've really been enjoying it here. So with respect to the lens that I bring to my ideas about surveillance, I'm going to join the chorus by saying that I absolutely bring an economic justice lens to this, and it's interesting, we each have kind of our individual takes on that. Iha was talking about worker discipline and power. Michelle was talking about extraction of money from the poor. And For me, those absolutely concern me, but my work is currently really focused on the enrichment of private actors. And so I see your comment, Joseph Knight, in the chat. So you kind of anticipated what I'm talking about here. The folks, the kind of big companies that are gathering people's data and not paying them for it and monetizing it, sometimes in multiple ways. My forthcoming article, which is coming out this spring in the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, is called Discrimination on Wheels, and talks about a particular kind of surveillance technology that monitors license plates, essentially passively captures license plates via a camera that captures data for any car that passes by, and then reports that into a data network. Before I kind of go on with that, I do want to make one point that we'll probably be talking about a lot about big data and algorithms and automated decision making, and they're kind of two separate issues. So surveillance being one issue, and then the algorithmic decision making being another one, and they are interrelated, but they're two issues. And with respect to surveillance, I kind of join with Michelle about concerns about scope, speed, and scale. My problem is when technology essentially facilitates surveillance that we would not be okay with in person. So for example, one story that I write about in my article is primarily focused on private actors, but there was a really nice news story that kind of encapsulated this technology I'm talking about very well, where in the protests in the wake of the George Floyd murder, there were police officers going by with these cameras, these surveillance cameras that track license plates, and were able to mine the license plates of many cars, hundreds of cars that just happened to be parked near protests or parked near places where looting took place. And then to circle back weeks later and impound those vehicles merely based on the fact that they had been parked near the site of protests or looting. And I think that most of us would be very concerned if we had to do this analog, right? So if the police departments were hiring multiple people to kind of scout and by hand write down people's license plates, or if private companies were sending people out to walk around neighborhoods and write down license plates, we'd be concerned about it. But when it's just on a camera that people pass by and it passively takes it, it's invisible to us. And also it becomes something that we don't feel as emotionally engaged in, or it doesn't provoke the same kind of response. And so that becomes really concerning, because that is the place where it really becomes that much more rife for potential abuse and really unfair enrichment to the parties that use it. And I'll say more, but I do want to, I'll turn the mic back over and we can continue the discussion.
Thanks, Nicole. And it's great that we have three panelists with a strong economic justice perspective. I will, where appropriate, bring a little bit of the criminal law perspective on this, because obviously the criminal legal system, as Nicole was alluding to, is very, very involved in surveillance technology. And it's a similar story of that not being a new thing, but the scale, speed, and scope of it has changed in this modern era. And so we'll go around the horn one more time in the same order. And this is to really invite you perhaps to engage in a little storytelling and address the question squarely of how our tools of surveillance affect inequality, right? Do they reproduce and worsen race and class differences? Is there a fundamental difference between so-called luxury surveillance and poor people's surveillance? What do you think? And are there any stories that you would tell that might concretize the experience for folks that are participating in today's webinar? Michelle.
All right. Well, I love to tell a story. I'm a trial lawyer. That's what it's all about. So you asked the magic question for me. So, yes, as all three of us have already highlighted, different groups in America based on race, economic status, gender, disability status, and other forms of identities, many of which are often intersectional, experience surveillance in different ways. And, I think it is important to acknowledge we are all subject to what's been called surveillance capitalism, right? A term that was coined by Harvard Business School professor Shoshana Zuboff. This idea that at all hours of the day and night, we are emitting data that companies are gathering for profit. And Nicole was talking about this as well. I think everyone knows, you go online, you're searching for sneakers or some household product, and then you are tracked across the internet with ads for that. And people find that annoying. There was a recent survey in the Washington Post where 82% of Americans said that online targeted advertising practices are annoying. 74% said they were invasive. But sort of the point of my research and my perspective is that the stakes of this surveillance capitalism are so much higher for marginalized communities. And that's because all these data points that merge into our digital profiles become gatekeepers to things that people need to live their lives, like housing, education, employment, what IHUB focuses on, healthcare, insurance, and the like. So for my story, I'll give you an example of a family that the clinic was representing last year. And in this family, the father was out of work for quite a while due to the pandemic. This is not an unusual story nationwide. The family fell behind on their rent and the landlord sought to evict them. And that's where my clinic students became involved in the case. At the time, we were able to put off the eviction because there was a nationwide moratorium on evictions. But even with a moratorium, people's rent continued to accrue throughout this time period. And it's the simple fact that there was an eviction filing against this family has been captured by tenant screening companies, right? Which are part of this big data ecosystem. 90% of landlords say they use tenant screening reports to select prospective tenants. And that means for our clients, this negative mark on their rental history will be folded into tenant screening reports and then impact their ability to obtain new housing in the future. And this happens even if they ultimately win the case, right? The algorithms don't distinguish between eviction cases where the tenant had a judgment entered against them and those where the tenants actually won, okay? And the evictions are just the tip of the iceberg because for this family, unpaid utility bills during this time, increased credit card debt during this time are being folded into other consumer reports like credit reports. And those are used far outside just the context of lending and loans. And so when we have these consumer reports that digitally encode people's economic hardship permanently, that reinforces these cycles of poverty. Even though the reports are often incorrect or incomplete, they lack transparency. So many of my clients, they don't even know they've been ensnared in these surveillance systems. They have no idea the reason they're not getting housing is they go from trudging from one landlord to the other. It's that they have an adverse tenant screening report against them. So there's just a real lack of transparency around these systems. And when you don't have transparency, you don't have accountability. And so again, we're all subject to data collection, but the consequences for low-income people are just much harsher and much more severe.
Thanks, Michelle. And you know, there's a similar kind of dynamic that you see in the criminal justice system, or as now we most often call it the criminal legal system, because some question whether true justice can be found there. And that is the fact of the lodging of a criminal charge against you becomes part of your record, even if you're acquitted of all those charges are dropped, and that can follow you around and become part of your record and be a reason to deny you bail, even if the arrest was completely unwarranted in a very literal sense. And so you see that same dynamic, and that same dynamic also disproportionately affects poor people and people of color, for sure.
And one thing I'll add to that, in the clinic, we spend a lot of time helping clients expunge their criminal records for the very reason Colin talked about, to open up more opportunities for them in housing, employment, and the like. The problem is, when we can get an expungement, it's removed from state databases, but it's already been scraped by a data broker. And so how do you find all those places where that data point appears, and how do you get rid of it? It's practically impossible. So expungement laws, they're absolutely essential, and they're so important, but the surveillance economy really can limit their effectiveness.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll turn it to Ihan now.
Yeah, thank you. I want to actually take that as a jumping off point to give a very good example of where this level of surveillance continues to play out in employment. And speaking of criminal background checks, labor groups and organizations and advocates have really been trying to partner with other community groups to work on ban the box, right? Because part of stopping the transfer of data or the replication and use of these data sets is to actually not allow them at all. And so that has been a big effort, because we recognize that this is very racially motivated. Those who get accused of, just accused of, not even prosecuted or arrested or stopped or any other form of discipline, are people of color, and they're also very low wage people as well. And so we recognize, labor recognizes from the beginning that it is a racial justice issue, and those consequences are imported into an employment context as well. And I'll give a very clear example. So my previous work was in retail, and there is actually a retail theft database, which is a database of employees accused, never convicted, just accused of theft, which is this long-standing argument about who is perceived to be the person that's going to steal. And employees are often identified as like potential thieves. And so this database exists and is shared among large retailers. So these retailers can access this database at any time and use it as a means to screening out and keeping employees from future jobs in those positions. And so in many ways, surveillance and collection of data very much does reinforce workplace dynamics. Another place, and maybe a little bit less obvious, that we see surveillance and algorithms really reinforcing inequalities is through automated wage theft, right? The way that algorithms can very quickly calculate how much an employee has earned and use the tips that they have gotten from customers in order to meet the minimum requirements that companies are required to pay for. This has been documented. Amazon, Instacart, DoorDash, among others, recently were penalized by the government for engaging in this practice, and they had to pay workers on those platforms back. And that's sort of, the issue of wage theft is not new. It happens a lot, or tip theft, but it's now been automated and scaled to hundreds of thousands of employees really quickly. I think Amazon's payout alone was $20 million. So it is definitely has the potential, and it is based on sort of the ability to track every minute detail of employee pay and tips in order to engage in this type of practice. There are so many ways to think about this. I'll talk about just that and one more instance of sort of the sort of surveillance being deployed as a means to address fraud, waste, and abuse that are further re-entrenching these inequalities and these ideas about who needs to be surveilled and who needs to be scrutinized. And a report that my colleague Alexander Matiscu at Data and Society published recently, called on electronic visit verification, looks at the other side of provisions of public services for clients who are requiring in-home supportive care. it was based on this federal legislation passed during the Obama administration as part of health modernization. That basically required in-home supportive care workers to log all of their activities using electronic visit verification system. And the whole concept behind, the whole idea behind it was that there was so much waste, fraud, and abuse happening within this realm. Her research pretty much shows that that was not the case. It made workers' jobs incredibly difficult, and it put clients in this position of essentially reducing their hours and reducing the care that they needed, and ultimately does nothing to improve the quality of care. So, and it's based entirely on surveillance and measurement of how workers perform their jobs. So it's still too early to see fully what this system will reveal, but in many places it has resulted in exactly that, which is a reduction in services and pay for clients and for workers. And ultimately in an industry where, I mean, right now there's already been a care shortage, but given the aging population and after COVID, there is real concerns that this type of system will just drive more people out of this particular industry.
Thank you, and feel free to post the link to that report in the chat. I see Michelle has been posting some links. Chris Stutz has been posting some links. It's super helpful so that folks who are on the webinar, if they want to dive deeper themselves, there's no way we're going to cover everything that we should cover in the short time we have. In fact, we've just gone over the halfway mark. I'll turn to Nicole to take up the question.
Thank you so much. And there's so much that my colleagues have already said. So what I'm going to focus on and what the focus of my paper is the importance of auto financing and auto insurance as two really important barriers to auto access. Auto access being extremely critical in most communities, just to be able to have a job, take your kids to school, et cetera, access healthcare, the whole 9 yards. And so auto insurance and auto financing are kind of inescapable costs for many people that inflate the cost of having a car. And so the technology that I had referred to previously, which is called automated license plate recognition technology, these kind of license plate scanning software. The companies that sell this software, they and maintain these data networks, monetize the data in two ways that I'll talk about really briefly. The first being with respect to asset recovery, and then the second being with respect to financial products. So first, with respect to asset recovery, most people are familiar with that by the name of repossession of automobiles. And in particular, the biggest company that sells this kind of software is called Digital Recovery Network, or DRN. So what DRN does is connect with repossessors, sell them the cameras, and then as they scan license plates to try and find cars that need to be repossessed where the purchaser is in default, they feed all of their scans back into the network, whether they themselves need that particular data or not. So the repossessors are really the collectors of the data, but then they're also the users of the data, because they can go back and use those historical scans going back, to the age of the network, in order to try and get a sense of where a given car may be located. Then the second way that DRN monetizes this data is by selling it for use in financial products. There are companies called fintech, or financial technology companies, often involving algorithmic decision-making, that try to compete with credit scoring companies in including different kinds of what they call alternative data, in order to try and and in their view, produce the next kind of big product with respect to consumer scoring. So many of us are familiar with Vantage Score or FICO scores that you can use to determine if you are able to get a loan or a credit card. But what has been found is that many people's information does not come up in those scoring tools because of the particular kind of data that they look at. Many fintech companies are trying to kind of change that game by including all manner of data that has not been used before. And DRN actually markets their data for use in things like setting insurance rates and deciding which consumers an auto insurance company should contract with. And so they've basically taken this data, this surveillance data, and tracked people's movements and then sold it over to a financial company so that the financial company can make their decisions. That was a lot, so I hope that that's kind of clear. And so that's really concerning to me in a number of regards. One, it's being repurposed for a completely different use than what it was gathered for. And then additionally, the collection itself is often flawed because repossessors, who are the ones primarily gathering this data, they have a very specific goal, which is to find cars that are in default. And there was an investigation by an advocacy group in Massachusetts, and they found that repossessors really kind of applied biases and stereotypes. So what they would do is, and someone actually admitted to this, that, well, I absolutely scan around low-income neighborhoods or public housing because that's where I think people don't pay their bills. That's not a quote, but that's basically the thrust of what was said. And so when you have this kind of surveillance where an individual person is making the judgment of, this is where I want to go to find people who don't pay their bills. And then this is now this data is now folded over into a completely new purpose and a different algorithm. Then this has a real potential to exacerbate inequality. And I wanted to speak directly to Paul Gilliam. I really appreciated your comment in the chat regarding transportation. And that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about as well. We already have a real problem in this country with transportation inequality and residential inequality, both of those kinds of infrastructure, because of the legacy of segregation, of redlining that has taken place in our country, that's really kind of fractured neighborhoods and made, and those legacies remain. We're still grappling with that. Anyone who's looked at the Build Back Better bill can see that a lot of those programs are focused to try and heal the legacy of infrastructural discrimination that has kind of fractured our communities. But what happens is that because these neighborhoods still have this residual segregation, is that data that the repossessors collect will then just reflect what's already happened. And someone who is in a low-income neighborhood or a neighborhood that is majority people of color may be overrepresented in the data set. And then now is getting that overrepresented data is now getting fed over to a financial company to help them decide whether that person can now get auto financing or get auto insurance. And so I'm really concerned about that. Something that I have said really made me think as well. If this overrepresentation or this skewed representation of different populations in a data set is going to result in a skewed algorithm or a skewed outcome when we feed that data back into a decision process. And it really made me think of, in that first year of COVID, who's on the road? Amazon, DoorDash, Instacart. And if you're using your own vehicle, probably less of an issue for Amazon, but certainly for DoorDash and Instacart, those are the people who are now going to be overrepresented, who are more likely to be low income, more likely to be of color. And so just their presence on the road may now be used to indicate some as a proxy for some other kind of characteristic. And because this is collected by private companies, they can resell and resell it. You know, even the database that I was talking about with the retail theft database, there's no reason for the company that collects that information not to resell it for some other purpose. And so we don't know where this data is going. It's being used for purposes that it wasn't collected for. And certain populations are just going to be overrepresented in the data sets. And so for all of those reasons, when we feed it into an algorithm, we're going to have a problematic outcome. And so that's what I've been focusing on in my scholarship. And I'm sure we'll continue to talk more about kind of the ramifications of that.
One thing I'll jump in quickly, if it's okay, is Paul had this comment about the great ways he's been able to use data and technology in his work in the transportation field. And I think all of us would agree that, of course, data and technology can have wonderful and useful impacts on people, but it's very contextual. And there are, big companies that make a lot of money trying to convince us that tech is going to solve all our problems. And it sort of led us to have a sense of techno-chauvinism, as Meredith Broussard, a data journalist, would say. And so I think what the three of us here are, trying to get folks to realize is we need to have a healthy skepticism towards those claims and understand that not all uses of tech are benign just because they're sophisticated, and that they have these differential impacts on different groups. But I do think it's worth acknowledging, yes, I've seen many ways that technology and data analysis have been wonderful for my clients, being able to apply online for public benefits, to apply online for jobs, different tools that can help people advocate for themselves in the judicial system. I know Colin and his students do amazing things with data for positive policy outcomes, and maybe he can talk a little bit about that. So I just want to acknowledge that comment, but it's a very contextual issue.
I completely agree. And, I think one thing that should raise a concern for you, Paul, is that while you and your organization are using tech and data to do that good work, some of the benefits that your communities are realizing may be getting undone at the same time by other private actors who don't have accountability and don't have the same kinds of incentives that you have.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Michelle and Nicole, and I'll ask you to speak in just a second. I just want to first acknowledge, I'm glad that we're beginning to address some of the questions and comments that are there. Panelists, if you want to separately, write little things to the Q&A, you should absolutely feel free. I hope that we can kind of open this discussion up so we won't go around the horn every single time. I have a question that I do want to ask that might pull some things together, but I know you want to jump in.
No, I think I can answer it later.
Okay, great. So let's talk about this issue because there, Bert, Boskert had also asked about, it seems like there's some good things about precision and accuracy that are out there, and that there are pre-existing problems of race and class divisions that, we can't blame these technologies for there. I know all of you are explaining how maybe it exacerbates it. We have to be aware of context. But how much, as we sit here and critique what's going on and try to raise the level of consciousness, how much should we be thinking about our own potential complicity in the culture of surveillance, right? Does the fact that many of us may track our children, for example, on their cell phones to make sure they're not driving badly or getting into accidents, does that matter? Does the fact that we sometimes celebrate videos posted on social media calling people out for bad behavior that we'd all agree is bad, but involves people filming and posting, does that matter? In other words, is there a grassroots culture of surveillance and monitoring that we also need to confront as we look at these problems, or is it all just about power and power differential? So I'll open it up. Any of you want to answer that. Or we can move on to some other questions.
Well, it's a big question, Colin. And I just want to say, I think it's kind of very charming that your example was to make sure that our kids are not driving badly. My child's not quite old enough yet, but I fully anticipate that if I surveil her, it will be to make sure that she's not somewhere she's not supposed to be, rather than to monitor her driving. But that does kind of go to power, right? Because if my concern is, and as someone who is more plugged into this ideal about the surveillance economy than other people, I know that the software that allows me to track my kid is probably going to be resold somewhere. But then I have to weigh that against the utility of, if my kid gets kidnapped, I want to know where their phone last was. And, so you're almost kind of holding that hostage, that ability to, potentially deal with a safety issue, or to improve something on that level where the stakes are very high, against the possibility of that data being, or really the near certainty of that data being resold for some other purpose. So some of the kinds of surveillance that we do participate in, we, even when we are aware, the stakes are pretty high.
Absolutely, but of course, the safety justification is it is the single largest justification for all the surveillance in the criminal legal system, right? The spy plane that was, eventually held, the program didn't continue, but it was also held to be unconstitutional. The idea behind that was to stop Baltimore's astronomical murder rate, right? Airport facial recognition is there to stop terrorists from getting on planes and doing another 9/11. School surveillance is said to try to stop school shooters or pedophiles from being in there. I mean, often it is about the safety of children.
Can I jump in? I think the word safety has been kind of weaponized. I don't know, that's probably the worst choice for a word, but you know what I'm saying. It has been used as a basis for so many different policies in the past. And I think, the examples you gave are clear, but then you have to think about who is the perpetrator and who are we keeping safe. And I think generally the terrorists have a particular image that we arrived at when this happened. It isn't the first time that we've had safety at the airport, but why was it after 9/11? What was it about this particular person who was the bad person? When it comes to safe neighborhoods, which neighborhoods are safe? And we are complicit in creating, or which neighborhoods are unsafe. That's what I mean. Like, where are we thinking where the unsafe neighborhoods are? Where are we thinking who are the untrustworthy people who need to be scrutinized, right? So it's not equally applied. It's like safety for some and imposition on others. And I'm currently engaging in a research project looking at Ring doorbell cameras in the context of employment, which is a little bit different because I think most have looked at Ring or not doorbell cameras in general, but sort of like doorbell cameras and the accompanying apps like Neighbors and Nextdoor, and sort of their ability to create digital gates, right? But the idea of like safety keeps coming up, and in an employment context, safety is actually not what people are really concerned about, even so they say that's the reason why they purchased the doorbell cameras. It's actually theft. So safety is such a broad term, it can mean anything. And so who are being pulled into, we are complicit in creating this mass surveillance network. To answer your early question, we don't have to wait for corporate entities in order to do it or the state to engage in it. People are buying it. And then companies are then creating relationships with law enforcement to create an even stronger network. But the question is like, who's pointing the camera at whom? And then who are we determining needs to be protected, and who do we think are the ones that are causing the problem?
Thank you.
And I would
didn't actually answer a question.
So interesting. When we talk about complicity, I think we also have to recognize that we don't really have a lot of choice with regard to a lot of these surveillance technologies. Unlike the examples like you provided, Colin, you really can't opt out of cyberspace in modern society. You need to access the internet and to have a smartphone to function, right? To do your job, to get on a plane, to just carry out basic tasks. You're being surveyed even when you're not aware of it. When you move through public spaces or retail spaces, or as Nicole's amazing research points out, when you drive around, your data is being captured, whether you know it or not. It's literally impossible to opt out of these systems. And people have tried unsuccessfully. People with very sophisticated understandings of technology and internet servers and the like. We really don't have a choice in it. So yes, there are ways in which many people are sort of voluntarily becoming arms of law enforcement or voluntarily becoming arms of surveillance capitalism, as Colin and I have pointed out. But, you know, even if you don't do that, you are complicit without your consent.
Right. So the argument from inevitability is always a tricky one to deal with, because you know, how do you respond to it? So maybe in the last few minutes that we have, we can turn to thinking about, well, how can we cabin this? How can we draw lines where there's no way we're going to get rid of everything? It's just here. But what are the principles or boundaries that we can put on this technology that actually, you know, have a chance of working out there? We're never going to go back in time and undo everything that's been done, but that doesn't mean that it has to be moving in the direction that it's moving now. So if we were to move it in a different direction, how would you advise that we think about it? Again, anyone that wants to jump in, we've only got a few minutes left.
I'll just jump in and say that I think, you know, I talked about from the worker perspective, the idea of surveillance like is just accepted in the workplace. But I think what many workers are experiencing is there are no boundaries around what an employer can surveil. They can say, wear this Fitbit that tracks your sleep habits, your eating habits, your diet habits, because that all affects performance and what you do at work. Or use this technology like Zoom, which can determine your affect. Like, are you smiling enough? If you're not smiling enough as a customer service worker, or if your voice doesn't sound happy enough, here's how you adjust it. Or Zoom actually has an attention detection feature. I believe they've disabled it, but I can't confirm. But these are all ways in which, you know, people are being surveilled, and it creates a lot of concerns for workers about how much of this is actually related to my job, right? How much of, where is the limit? Do I need to have something that's physically on my body? Do you need to scan my retina? Or is there an alternative way of doing this, which is not as invasive? And related questions, like we do have labor laws. You know, the US is not like Europe, but there are actually labor laws around workplace health and safety, around, you know, minimum and maximum hours of work, rest, theft, that are either sort of the being hidden and not protected, or we lack an enforcement. So that we have to bring back up these questions of like, are there other ways to accomplish those goals? Because the technology can be optimized for anything. So it could be optimized for safety. It's not. So it really is not we can't escape this. It's sort of two competing ideas about like what surveillance and technologies can be used for. And I think the limits may lie with the limits around greed and corporate greed in some cases, at least in the employment case.
Just to throw out a potential solution that's been asked, or impact or way of thinking about it, it's been asked in the chat. There's a lot of discussion about legislation, and Amelia had asked about the GDPR in the EU or California Consumer Privacy Act. Are those things that we should be looking for? Have they had an effect? Do any of you have opinion on that?
I think it's a little too early to know yet the effect that they're going to have, but they do provide a lot of valuable rights to us as citizens that shifts some of the power from government and corporations to individuals to control our data, giving people rights to understand when and how their data is collected, to limit how long it's retained, to have it erased altogether. These are great ideas in theory, and a lot of it is going to depend on, are the laws enforced and how well are they enforced? So time will tell, but anything that sort of shifts the power balance towards people is a good thing. And just another recommendation that I have along those lines is I would like to see a lot more stakeholder input into the adoption of these technological tools, and get a diverse group of people who are impacted, the folks who develop the technology, the folks that are seeking the technology, and have much more robust assessments together as to the impacts of these form of technology. Because right now the people impacted are pretty much cut out from the technology development altogether. So, I am interested in ways to shift the power a bit, and stakeholder input is one way in my mind that would be beneficial.
Wonderful. So we've got the notion of focus and thinking about the laws that exist that we can enforce, have non-invasive modes where possible, shifting the power balance, injecting a little transparency and democracy in the decision-making. All of these are ways of thinking about the problem in a more sophisticated way, right? Because part of it is, I think I like the phrase of technological chauvinism, or people being wowed by things and not asking those critical questions. We can't just put it all in one box. Nicole, is there anything you'd like to add on the solutions or ways of thinking about limits kind of idea?
Yeah, I mean, and so, we've talked a little bit about changes that we would make to the collection of the data, but also the use. And so injecting not just transparency on the collection of data, but also transparency on the kinds of algorithms that we use to process it and to monetize it, right? And so Tony Marie had a great comment in the chat regarding Gillibrand's Data Protection Act, or to have a data protection agency. And I think that that's absolutely critical. And as part of that, to have an algorithmic accountability agency, whether that is another agency or, if they're kind of both doing, working within the same, under the same umbrella, taking trade secret protection away from these algorithms that are looked at as being, each company's kind of secret sauce they claim is better than everyone else's, but don't have to prove. I think that injecting that kind of accountability will then also either make the data work to the good, or will make it less attractive economically. And so perhaps, that could be just spitballing, but perhaps would undermine the readiness of these private companies to collect so much invasive data.
Well, thank you so much.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one comment in reference to a question earlier about playing devil's advocate about, do we give up efficiency in order to provide public services? That's a value decision. I mean, like I mentioned around EVV, it wasn't about good quality delivery. It was about scrutinizing fraud, waste, and abuse. That's the efficiency factor that was being optimized for through the technology. So we have to look at what exactly we're hoping to optimize for. And so currently, right now, surveillance is optimized for data extraction. But should that be the basis from which we're starting with to begin with? And I think this is sort of related to the reliance on data as opposed to information to make our decisions. And I think that has to do with the comment about it's been very useful in transportation. I've been at plenty of community stakeholder conversations around transportation in low-income areas long before data was used. Low-income people have said the exact same thing that the data shows, but they were not listened to. And that was information, it was important. So there's this reliance on data. We need the data. Maybe we don't actually need all that data. And that would essentially say we don't need all that surveillance.
Excellent. More is not always better, and it does always come down to values. But in order to be able to assess claims of values or assess claims of usefulness, you have to have some literacy. And I do hope this discussion has helped advance the conversation on literacy or get people more interested in upping their own game. I know I've certainly learned a lot. I'd love to thank all of our panelists for their excellent contributions today, and thank Chris Stutz for organizing this and all the webinars. I think we've come to the end of our time, and so I believe it's time for us to end. If there's anything that anyone would like to say by way of a brief 5-second closing, please do. Otherwise, I think it's time to say goodbye. All right then. Bye, everyone.
Joining us. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.